And to finish off our space talk, we have Dr. Vishal Sharma from iValley, who will do our last presentation.
Thanks so much. Can I just get a hand up so I can walk on? So thanks, everyone, for staying back, and thank you for the basic introduction. So I'm Vishal Sharma. I'm actually a technologist based out of Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. And my interest is more coming at things from an infrastructure perspective. So I worked in the infrastructure of the internet, starting out in the early days in the late 90s, and then moving on as technology evolved into looking at, wireless networking and various other forms of networking, and then eventually into sort of cloud computing. And the reason I'm here today is because I have an interest in the intersection of infrastructure with how it gets financed, and then, how the intellectual property issues come up. And I'll give you a brief introduction today in a few minutes to what we are thinking about in what we call space internet. This is my colleagues and I, so let's run the video first. That gives us a good segue into what I want to talk about in the next few minutes. So the last 250 years, we've actually seen about 6 innovation cycles in our living memory, and they're listed here. So if you go back, starting in the 1750s all the way to the 1830s was the first industrial revolution starting out in England. And concurrently with that, around 1812, George Stephenson invented the steam locomotive, and then brought about the age of steam and railways. And in parallel with that, around the 1800s, electricity started to be developed and worked on. Volta invented the cell in 1800. Faraday invented a basic electric motor in 1830. In late 1870s, we know about Edison's discoveries and inventions. And then moving on from there, there was Westinghouse, there was Tesla, and so forth. And we had the age of DC motors and DC power distribution, and then, of course, AC distribution, which brought us with the invention by Bessemer of industrialized steel production in 1850s to the age of steel and electricity, taking us all the way from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, around about when Henry Ford most famously began the mass production of his Model T in about 1913, which led us to the age of the automobile and mass production and everything else in the next 30, 40 years, which finally in the 1950s brought us to the age of ICT. And really, we are at the present time living through the age of digitalization and virtualization, which I'll talk about in a second. And we'll be moving on from there to the next innovation cycle, which is really space tech. So ICT began really in the 1950s with the invention of the microprocessor, the integrated circuit, mainframe computing, and the explosion of all kinds of electronics and information technology with our computers, and moving on to the 70s with smaller machines, desktops, laptops, and so on. And it led to miniaturization, to the development of sensors, mobile technology, mobile phones that we are also familiar with today, and brings us all the way to about the 2000 timeframe, at which point this was followed, by what I call the age of digitalization and virtualization, where there were advances in computing, in storage, in communications, which basically brought us to about 2010. And this has led to all of the developments that we are also familiar with. But starting in about 2010 and a little bit earlier, we saw the emergence of space technology. Now, of course, we've had space and for the last 50 years, but the way it's re-emerged in the last 10 or 12 years is quite different from what we've had in the past. In a sense, we can say that it's really the resurgence, a second resurgence, if you will, of space tech. And this was because there's a recognition that space-based technologies can play a significant role, both in solving some important problems and in filling out infrastructure gaps. And of course, John gave you a preview of the kind of interesting problems that people are working on, not just for use in space later, but use on terra firma first. And then, of course, we all understand, we've heard about many, even earlier in this event, about the infrastructure problems or the finance problems that you want to solve as you try to embrace an all-inclusive, all-world kind of framework. So what has happened is that we are seeing a resurgence, like I said, after the 1960s, in a second wave of space tech. We've already had the miniaturization, et cetera, I spoke about earlier. But really today, the difference is that a number of the cloud computing companies and private enterprise are thinking about space. And they're thinking about it because they want to expand their reach into parts of the world where internet is not available today and access is not available today, and also because they want to make it more affordable. The other difference is that a lot of funding from private sources, literally tens of billions of dollars, is going into it, and we all know the familiar names, SpaceX and Amazon Space Initiatives, Virgin Galactic, and so on, OneWeb. But the emphasis now is moving towards the launch of what we call low Earth orbit satellites, or LEO satellites, which are smaller, cheaper, hardier than their GEO cousins, and are also an order of magnitude cheaper. So you think of a satellite, you think about a $100 million investment. But today you can do that at a few $1 billion. And in fact, John talked about Planet Labs, which launches very small satellites, literally the size of a cube, called CubeSats, that are, I think, even less than $1 million. And so those are the kinds of advances that are possible with the development of technology and innovation we've already had, which make it now feasible for us to get into space. And there's been advances in launch technologies. There's been advances in the hardware and software with which you can build satellites. And there have been advances in the way you can actually build the rockets that will launch those satellites. So given all of this, myself, my colleagues at Zona Partners are partnering with Paddy and the iValley team, and we're thinking about Spacetechtalk 2020, which is really the intersection of space with the finance world and the investment world, because you can't do this without significant investment, which is already happening. But you still need to track where it goes and in which particular areas of space. And then the other part is the intersection of that with the internet, because to make all of the infrastructure that John was talking about and to make the communications behind that work, you need the so-called space internet infrastructure to make it happen. So that's really what I wanted to introduce, that this is going to be a focal point for both education and experimentation in this space arena, and hopefully for acceleration of startups that are playing at the intersection of these spaces of space and finance and the internet. And then I welcome any questions that the audience may have. All right, thank you very much.